Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Over the past 10 years, as you tuned into the show, you notice that we tend to talk about the 50-plus community and the baby boomer. But that's slowly changing. But a lot of other things on the landscape are changing as well, especially the fact that this is a generation that for the first time, many of them aren't retiring at the typical age that they tend to. Well, it isn't a matter of do they want to retire. Sometimes maybe they do. Sometimes maybe they don't. But the fact is we're looking at 80 million. That's right, 80 million people that are about to make this big transition to decide whether they're going to stay in the workforce or decide to retire. Most of them aren't. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is Cash Nickerson. He is an attorney and current president and chief financial officer of Palios Tech Incorporated, which is the fourth largest engineering and IT staffing firm in the country. We're going to be talking about his book, BOOMERangs, and finding out how we can get to deal with this aging workforce in America. Cash, how are you doing today?
I'm good, Daniel.
This is really an interesting topic because of how you approach it. Most people are talking about, how do we deal with, for instance, the healthcare side of this whole thing, but there's so much more to this element here that needs to be explored and dealt with. Tell us about how you decided to put this book together.
Well, I noticed in my work that increasingly people were coming to me in their 50s and 60s who had left the workforce through either some corporate buyout or a voluntary retirement, and were looking to get back in. And there was no clear return path for those people. Mm-hmm. And some of them weren't happy with retirement. Some of them had financial circumstances that changed because of the recession. So that was a major factor. The other aspect that I noticed and had a number of focus groups with aging engineers is I noticed that a lot of the workforce that was still in the workforce wanted to stay in the workforce. They just wanted to do it on their terms and have more flexibility. And particularly with the engineering workforce, I also noted that the companies were on the verge of a tremendous talent drain. Some of the major aerospace and defense companies were looking at half their employees eligible for retirement without a backfill behind it. So I came at it from a workforce needs perspective and a people desiring to stay in the workforce, and how we gonna make that happen.
Mm-hmm. I know it was some time ago that we were talking about this on the program, and the challenges that face someone, an aging person in the workforce, and some of the, I guess you could call them obstacles, if you will, for them staying on the job versus younger people taking over. One of those things, obviously, is the fact that sometimes they just kind of feel set in their ways, so to speak, And, as you were talking about there, let's talk about that a little bit to give people a little more scope on what's going on here.
Well, the workplace was designed for young people and has not changed and aged with our aging. So, if it had, if you imagine, as I mentioned in the book, imagine that conference rooms would have reading glasses in them, but they don't. So, the workplace was sort of designed around us when we were young and has not really altered. And so there's a tremendous amount of ergonomics risk, screen sizes, print sizes, all the things that are challenging for an aging population the workplace has not readily adapted to.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know we were just recently talking about Social Security and the idea that this has actually been something that's been pretty much drained for quite a while now. That's one of those big issues that you also talk about here in the book, BOOMERangs.
Yes, if we don't find a way to keep people in the workplace longer by having more flexible hours or fractionalizing the work week, the burden on Social Security of the 80 million people, I mean, by most estimates, the trust fund runs out in around 2035, and the benefits won't be able to flow the way they have in the past. Mm-hmm. So it's extremely important that we restructure retirement away from an on or off switch and more towards a decelerating phase, so that our work life mirrors our new longevity life. And so life is more like a boomerang. At one time you work, retire, die, and now we've got this much more smooth boomerang where people have this new third age, 65 to 80, but there's no work mechanisms designed to mirror that. So you climb the corporate ladder, and then you climb down the corporate ladder in terms of job.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know one of the biggest challenges, too, because you take a look at the idea of retirement, that comes from an industrial-aged way of thinking. I mean, the United States at one time was a country of manufacturing, so you had a lot of people in the workforce that were blue-collar workers. Now, for instance, it seems a little difficult to see somebody who's in their 60s, for instance, maybe working for the Ford Motor Company putting cars together. Manual labor, especially for someone like that, would be a little difficult to keep up. So, how do you address something like that?
I think that's the biggest challenge.
Mm-hmm.
The Age Discrimination and Employment Act was passed in 1967, actually, as a result of a number of civil rights laws, but it was really before the information age kicked off, which most people recognize as being in the early 70s. And so discussions about the ability to work longer really take place in the context of the information age and even sort of the independent age of the ability to work from home and work, altering work schedules because you have remote access. The blue-collar aspect of retirement is, I think, the most difficult. Now we have, a smaller percentage of manufacturing, but there's still a tremendous amount of workers in that blue-collar space for which it is harder to imagine. What we've seen people do in some of my research is that they've migrated into jobs that are still maybe physical labor, but much less physical in labor. But there's still fewer of them. So we've seen, and as I mentioned in the book, I've interviewed some people who were in heavy blue-collar jobs who migrated into trucking, over-the-road trucking, but I think that's the biggest challenge, is that aspect of retirement, the blue-collar, hands-on laborer.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing too that you point out, especially about this generation, is the fact that you're looking at a population of people that are also very stable. They're rooted into their communities. So they don't have the mobility, for instance, when a recession hits and things kind of dry up in the area that they're living in. It's not so easy for these people to just pick up and go somewhere else.
No, that's a very, very big problem, because when we look at job creation and talent imbalances and job imbalances, one of the reasons that jobs came back and are still coming back so slowly from the Great Recession as because the Great Recession was involved with housing. And so even if there was an opportunity for you in Fort Worth, Texas, if you were in Detroit and couldn't sell your house, you couldn't get to it. Well, the same is true of the aging population. They're dug into their communities. If they've relocated, they've really relocated to be closer to children and grandchildren. And the job that exists in North Dakota is not something that I, as someone who's with my children in Sacramento, am going to consider being mobile for that job at a more advanced age. So that is a real challenge. Mobility gets in the way.
Mm-hmm. I know that you were talking earlier in the book about some that are actually, I'm trying to think of the right word here, consulting for the team at Facebook, and how they tend to feel kind of ancient compared to a bunch of 30-somethings, And you can see how that would be kind of difficult to realize, do I feel like I belong, when it comes to a workforce with that kind of an age group.
Yeah, no question. And the workplace today is a 4-layer cake. For the first time in our history, we actually have 4 generations in the workplace. So you have the group beyond the boomers, which are like the veterans or disciplinarians, traditionalists, and behind them you have the boomers, and then you have Gen X, and then you have the millennials. And you don't see them socializing together or working together. What you see, in fact, is biases come out. So the young people think that the older people aren't interested in technology and slow to adapt to new things, and the elder population in the workforce looks at the younger like every time they walk by, they quick hit a key to hide the game that they're playing or Facebook that they're toying with. And so these are deeply rooted biases that actually come out of our personal lives that then manifest themselves in the workplace. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done around trying to eliminate those biases and get the multi-generations working together better.
Mm-hmm. Now, most places will tend to have, especially, there's usually one or two employees, depending on the size of the workforce of the company, that tend to maybe not be as reliable, calling in sick, things like that. But this is also a generation of people, as we think of the boomerangs, that disability is kind of one of those things that are on the horizon a little bit more often than they would be as someone is younger. Talk about some of the challenges that companies face with boomerangs being in the workforce when it comes to things like disability.
Right. Well, the odds of having a disability from the youngest segment in the workforce is like 9%. And in the higher segments in the workforce, it's 42%. And that's just a reality of aging. Usually those disabilities, don't affect their ability to do their work, but it may make them prone to accidents, to falling, and this is what executives need to concern themselves with is sort of proofing their workplace for the aging population, maybe even getting a focus group together of some of the aging population in the workforce and looking at things that are risks for them. So they're at a much higher risk of being injured. They're much higher risk to have a disability. And if you already have an issue with a joint or something, you're more likely to get injured, whether you're at work or you're at home. But you spend a lot of time at work, and so it's a real issue for the employers. And it's one reason, frankly, that employers seek to move people on because they don't want that risk in the workplace.
Mm-hmm. Now, you also say, too, another challenge, you call it the intergenerational layer cake. And I found that to be interesting. But you're looking at 4 generations of prevailing attitudes unique to each one that have to find a way to coexist in a positive way for things to work well. Tell us about some of those challenges between these generations here and the way they see things.
Well, it's interesting. Definitely, there was a Harvard Business Review article called Transference, and what it said is that we bring into the workplace our attitudes from the home. So they had studies that show if you fight with your sisters at home, you tend to fight with female employees. If you're a negotiator at home, you tend to be a negotiator at work. And so imagine that, you're a person in their 50s or 60s in the workplace, and you're working around young people. They sort of look like children to you. And if you're a young person working in the workplace and you see elder people, maybe somebody in their 60s, that could look like your grandfather or grandmother. And your bias is that, your grandmother or grandfather, when they got the latest thing at Christmas or other holiday, they didn't know how to put batteries in it. So how are they going to be able to use a computer, or how could they be able to technology? So at those extremes, you see those kinds of biases, and they're inevitable because we just bring them right from home.
You kind of have to take a look at this and wonder, it seems to me that everyone needs to find ways of adapting from their own part to reach a common goal. I know that in the book you also talk about how laws, especially with the age discrimination, need to be looked at and perhaps changed a little bit. Tell us what kind of changes you think should be done with this generation here in the workforce when it comes to the law.
The Age Discrimination in Employment Act was passed with other civil rights laws. And what that means is it was treated like any other form of discrimination. So what that means is generally something that's a process, aging, was treated as if it's an on-off switch, like you're male or female, black, white, Christian, not Christian, all these other civil rights, you either are or you aren't, as opposed to aging, which at one time you were young or old, but now that lifespan has increased, aging is a process, and the law says you just can't discriminate based on age, starting at age 40. Think about how almost silly that is, age 40. And people don't understand the drastic changes, or maybe aren't aware of the drastic changes in longevity. In 1930, the average life expectancy of a male was 56, and a female was 62. I had a granddaughter born in January. She has a 50% chance of living to 100. So you've got dramatic changes in longevity. And so what needs to change in the law is, instead of just saying you just can't discriminate based on age, it needs to be revised so that we allow open discussion between employers and employees with respect to downscaling employment. And those kinds of conversations are not legal right now. You would be violating because you're singling them out because they're older. But in fact, it makes sense to single them out because they're older and start introducing maybe a 10-year retirement or a 7-year retirement where you phase out over time, stay in the workplace, which is good for it's a win-win-win. It's better for the government because there's less social service payouts. It's better for the employer because they are able to retain skill sets that are important. And it's better for the employees because they get to stay engaged longer. And we know that employees engaged in the workplace who are elderly get sick less, get hurt less. So it's a win-win-win, and it needs to be undertaken.
Well, we've certainly covered on the program ways that people age gracefully. And one of those is to keep them, as you were just saying, engaged in things and not just, sitting around somewhere, perhaps even in a retirement home where nobody goes to visit them and eventually they just slowly fade away, which is really a difficult way to find somebody having to spend the last parts of their lives. But it's interesting because you outline 20 things that these boomerangs need to be aware of about staying in the workforce. And there were one or two that I kind of wanted to cover here, but one of them was that just caught my eye real quick was lay off the war stories. What's that all about? I mean, I kind of guessed on that one, but but you could just see it. Well, when I was your age, I used to have to walk to work, on barefoot and it's in the snow and that sort of a thing. But I could see where that could be a problem because here you have these millennials, of course, of the Gen Xers, and these are people that believe in team play, and doing something for a great outcome, so to speak. Tell us about that there, lay off the war stories.
Well, it's if you watch millennials or younger people in the workplace, while someone older is saying, when I was your age, or I remember 30 years ago, the glaze over is palpable. You can feel it. And I saw it vividly about 9 months ago. I was on a business development call to provide IT staffing to a major IT firm in the Silicon Valley, and I had a couple of people with me, and one of them, the person who was buying the services was about 32, and the person I was with was late 50s, and the person in the late 50s started talking about what it was like to do business with that company 25 years ago. And I mean, it almost cost a sale, because it's not relevant. They don't care. It's not instructive. It's the opposite of exactly how millennials think. They're thinking about the future. They're looking forward. So young people tend to look forward, and aging people tend to look backwards. Aging people the people who age the best are always looking forward. And so it's a very important tell that one of those underlying tells people use to say that person's old. Why? They tell stories that make them sound old. So it's really working against yourself when you do those kind of things.
Well, it's really a challenge when you think about it, too, Cash, is the fact that you're looking at a generation of people that are really facing mortality a lot more than, of course, Generation X and the millennials. As you said, these younger people are ones that tend to look forward to the future, whereas we tend to look at the past like, what do we have left? What have we left behind? What is our legacy, so to speak? And you can see the tendency to kind of reflect backwards on that, but the truth is, if you can look forward and take that one step in the moment day by day, you still have a lot more that you can contribute, and I think that would be better for everybody, wouldn't it?
Yes, and we just picked this habit up from the people that were a generation ahead of us. They did the same thing. We didn't invent it. We didn't invent war stories. In fact, if you think about the term war story, that probably goes back to maybe the Civil War or World War I, the concept of a war story. I have to research and see when it started, but it definitely started well before boomers. Boomers weren't really particular, warring people, but it probably comes out of the generation ahead. And I've seen it in, when you do a group exercise. When I was a young employee at Union Pacific Railroad, when they put up the rules for having a discussion, one of them was, suspend judgment, and another one was no war stories, and that was in 1985. So the no war stories have been around for a long time, but it's a habit we picked up from previous generation, but the fact is we're too young to be telling war stories, and we need to be thinking forward like the people that we're working around and imagining and envisioning.
Well, and think about having an attitude like that, too, about thinking ahead, and being innovative, for instance, and creative, and especially the fact that you're drawing from a lot of life experience. Now, having been in the workforce where I had actually worked with older generations, the ones that stood out the most, it was really enjoyable to watch this happen. They tended to be playful, upbeat, positive. They would hang out, whether it was during lunches or, after work, they would go out and they would share, ideas and things to be creatively thought about. And what you would tend to hear about these particular kinds of people would be, I hope I'm a lot like that when I become that age. And you give an exercise here, and as I understand that you are a third-degree black belt in Kempo Karate, so it was no surprise here that one of your tips here was breathe yourself young. Tell us about that one.
Well, that one I consider like almost the most important, because if you breathe right, you feel young, you act young, and it's not young like a teenager, but it's much younger. So I took up Russian martial art. And they have these Secrets of the Russian Breath Master's book back from the old Cossack days. And basically, there are 7 principles of breathing, and I've taught classes in breathing, and I've seen a profound difference, and people have wrote me there's a difference, but it's things like breathing in through your nose and out through your mouth, and only taking in as much air as you want. It's amazing we don't teach children, we don't teach anybody how to breathe. We actually breathe very well when we're young, but muscle memory and stress gets in the way as we get older, and we unlearn good breathing habits, and so you actually need to relearn them. So I'm a big believer in the breath principles and learning how to breathe. If you just take this simple exercise and just as you take a step, breathe in, and as you take a step, breathe out, and then as you take 2 steps, breathe in, 2 steps, breathe out, and you can actually train yourself to breathe more vibrantly. And if you breathe more vibrantly, you will be a more vibrant person.
Mm-hmm. Now for those who are having a real challenge, especially being in the workforce at this age, do you recommend the possibility of maybe starting their own small business?
We certainly see that, and it's certainly in some ways easier than ever to do that, because we live in an age with technology. We live in an age where there's like online kits to start a business, and it's certainly something that people are doing because we don't yet have the corporate America work structures to allow it. So we do see people picking up their passion, and they're what I call like modern Palios. modern hunter and gatherers and just sort of put things together and make a living and eke by. And that is something that we're seeing increasingly happen. And we could probably do a better job with structures to support them. But that is absolutely one of the results of us not having good policies in the workforce, is people are doing sort of what they can.
The book is Boomerangs. Our guest joining us today, Cash Nickerson, is talking about this aging workforce that is certainly growing in population and how we're able to cope with something like this. You outline with great tips talking about also the Age Discrimination Act and how there needs to be changes in that as well. You know, it's just really fascinating when you take a look at this. It seems that there aren't really any easy answers, but there's obvious answers to this problem, isn't there?
Yes, I think, as I said, the Age Discrimination Act we need to take another look at that. And then companies themselves can begin having dialogues with their workers. Obviously, they have to be careful of the Age Discrimination Act, but based on everything that I interact with in terms of the aging workforce, they would welcome opportunities to not be just laid off, but to decelerate their jobs into maybe three-quarter pay for three-quarter money, or half pay for half money, or seasonal work. And so we need to rapidly get those kinds of conversations going and really end the 40-hour work week, because that's something that that archaic notion gets in the way of really what modern life is like.
Isn't that the truth? I remember working in a place many years ago, and it was also a place that was highly employed by Hispanics. And it was funny because I was seeing the notes of these weekly Monday morning meetings that they have, you know, of course includes the supervisors and whatnot. And one of the things that one of the supervisors was saying is that the labor force on the manufacturing floor was, you know, their self-esteem or whatever it was, they were just really aggravated because they weren't getting their 40 hours. I'm thinking, you know, you should look at that as a blessing.
Exactly.
You know, especially this day and age, and you consider, you know, because as you read through this book, Boomerangs, you know, what I felt really began to emerge was to be creatively employed, as you were saying. You know, maybe spend 10 or 20 hours at this company over here, and maybe, you know, 5 or 10 at this one over here, to where you find a sense of belonging and contribution to what you're doing, rather than, you know, one of them stick in the muds like, you know, I put in my time and I feel this sort of sense of entitlement, of respect, you know, sort of a thing. And I think that's something that you continually, you know, earn, especially as you're in the workforce, regardless of what your age is.
I couldn't agree with you more.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the 40-hour work week arose out of somebody thinking, I know there's 24 hours in a day. You should have 8 hours of sleep, 8 hours of leisure, and 8 hours of work. A third. And then 8 times 5 was 40. I mean, that's really where it came from. and it's just one of those things that stuck. And you know it's not realistic if you just walk down the halls of almost any business in America, and you're going to see people on the phone dealing with caregiving issues, people playing on Facebook, people, and if you go to their homes, you'll see them with a PDA doing a little work in between chores at home. The modern humans really we're not designed to say, okay, sit in this chair and do nothing but this for 8 hours. And then you can have your 8 hours of leisure. It's just not how we're living, which means it's not how we're designed. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of like, you know, we spent much more of our history as hunters and gatherers than we did as farmers, and I think we miss it a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Well, Cash, I think you also hit something on the nail there when you talk about how we're not designed to do that. And proof in the pudding is, take a look at our education system. It's based on almost the same principle. You know, you go in, you sit in class for 8 hours. You know, at least by junior high and high school, you get a chance to go to different classes, but it's still the same thing. And that's not working too well because, you know, we're at 1 in 2 kids, it seems like, or 1 in 3 kids are dropping out of high school now. So,
That's right.
So what you're saying must be true.
And the ones that are staying in, we drug up to make sure they absolutely don't let their mind wander.
Well,
what does that tell you?
Exactly. This is a great book, especially for boomerangs to understand, that you have to take a look at the reality. You're here now. What are you going to do about it? And it's certainly something that people really should read. Is there a website people can find out more about this and your work?
Sure. It's www.cashnickerson.com. And also, I publish on LinkedIn, so you can go look me up on LinkedIn and read some of my articles that are published there, including one I recently did, The Coming Civil War for Jobs in America Without Change, how boomers and millennials are going to be fighting over the same jobs.
Fascinating stuff. Cash, thank you so much for joining us here on the program today.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I really enjoyed it.
You betcha. You can also find out more. Visit us at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We'll have more information for you as well. Also sign up for our weekly exclusive updates. You'll find that there on our website as well. Thank you again for joining us. I'm Daniel Davis. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. And remember, live your day past halfway.